radio station that broadcasts in 5 different languages.
L'Afrique du Sud célèbre la journée nationale du
Kabla hujaitwa kwa jina la Double K or more of our forests have been destroyed.
Partido Africano da Independência da Guiné.
See, Channel Africa represents every corner of this amazing land. From Lagos to Cape Town, Nairobi to Dakar, we've got you covered with the freshest news, music, and cultures. So, turn up the volume, feel the rhythm. And join the conversation. Channel Africa, the African perspective.
Maremo Samo no Caleidoscópio das 20 às 21 horas de Johannesburg.
When the sun goes down, we don't stop the talk. Channel Africa, the best nighttime radio.
A very good evening to you and welcome to Africa World Hour. This is Channel Africa, the African perspective. We're coming to you live from our studios in Johannesburg, South Africa. Catch us live on SABC Plus app. Of course, on DSTV's audio bouquet is Channel 802 and OpenView Channel 628. My name is Innocent Semosa, in for Tsepiso Maketwetla. We've got a beautiful show ahead of you. All right, top stories that made headlines today. We go to Kenya. Kenyan prominent activist Boniface Mwangi has been released on bail after being charged with illegal possession of ammunition linked to protests last month in which at least 19 people were killed. Now, Mwangi pleaded not guilty and was released on bail. He once ran for parliament on an anti-corruption platform and has earned a reputation for speaking against, or should I say, out against human rights violation in Kenya and abroad. He was expelled from neighboring Tanzania in May, where he had traveled to observe a hearing in a treason case against an opposition figure. The BBC's Akisa Wandera has more.
Inside the Nairobi court, his supporters sang the Kenyan national anthem. Mr. Mwangi was arrested over the weekend at his home near the capital, with detectives initially accusing him of facilitating terrorism linked to last month's anti-government protests. During the raid, police said they recovered tear gas canisters and a blank ammunition cartridge. Amnesty International and local human rights groups have described the case as criminalizing dissent.
Australian-based AVZ Minerals, which holds a majority stake in the contested Manono lithium project in the Democratic Republic of Congo, says a new deal between Kinshasa and US-backed cobalt metals to develop part of the project breached an existing international arbitration order. The DRC government recently said that it had signed an agreement with Cobalt to jointly develop the Southern Africa section of the Manono lithium and tin deposit, one of the world's largest untapped sources of the battery metal. Bundle Hedbosch reports.
The agreement signed by the DRC government and Cobalt commits the Congolese government to support Cobalt's plans to acquire and develop the Rochadura deposit at Manono. This effectively positions the California-based firm as Kinshasa's preferred partner to unlock the stalled project. Meanwhile, AVZ Minerals is currently locked in arbitration with the DRC at the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes over the government's failure to grant them a mining permit. For Channel Africa Business, I am Buntle Hetbush.
Botswana's President Duma Boko has called for unity between the Economic Freedom Party and the African National Congress. This comes after both parties were invited to attend the first Botswana National Front conference following their historic win in the 2024 elections. Boko says he hoped the EFF and the ANC will put aside their differences.
Economic freedom fighters, the African National Congress, all of them must step up in order to step back and reflect on the existential threat that faces their country and the rest of the region, and indeed the continent. And when they do, I hope they rise above and beyond some of these differences.
Now, Ukrainian Defense Minister Denis Shmyhal says Ukraine needs $6 billion to close this year's defense procurement gap. Russia launched its first full-scale invasion of Ukraine 3.5 years ago. Shmyhal was speaking during an online meeting with the Ukrainian Defense Contact Group. It's, of course, headed by German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius and his British counterpart. U.S. Defense Secretary John Henley called for a 50-day drive to provide Ukraine with more military equipment. His message was backed up by German's Pistorius.
This sends a clear message to Putin. Dragging out the war will come at an ever higher cost to him. Ukraine will continue to successfully defy Putin's war machine and will weaken it a little more every day. It is our duty, colleagues, and our obligation to actively support our Ukrainian friends in this regard.
All right, an Indian court has acquitted 12 men convicted for a wave of train bombing in Mumbai 2 decades ago that killed nearly 200 people and injured more than 800 others. 5 had been sentenced to death and the rest to life imprisonment. The BBC Sanjay Deshgupta has the details.
Almost 10 years after they were first sentenced, 12 Muslim men convicted of involvement in a terror attack will now walk free. In a damning verdict, 2 judges of the Bombay High Court found that evidence used against them was unreliable. They also identified serious flaws in the police investigation. The crime the men had been convicted of was one of the most horrific in recent memory. On a July evening rush hour in 2006, 7 bombs ripped through a number of packed local trains in Mumbai, killing 189 people and leaving 800 others injured.
The pulse of the continent in 60 minutes. Stay informed and inspired with Africa World Hour on Channel Africa.
It's exactly 7 minutes Central African time. This is Channel Africa. We are coming to you live from our studios in Johannesburg, South Africa. Follow us on social media for updates, highlights, and exclusive content. Of course, on X, we're at Channel Africa 1. On Facebook, Channel Africa. On Instagram is at Channel Africa 1. On TikTok, we're, of course, at Channel Africa 1. On YouTube, at Channel Africa 1. On to this now. The new governing party in Botswana, or should I say the new governing party in Botswana, the Botswana National Front, BNF, is on a charm offensive to foster unity with neighboring countries. Both the Economic Freedom Fighters and the African National Congress were invited to attend the party's first conference in Palabje this past weekend. The BNF come to power after the 2024 elections, overtaking the Botswana Democratic Party that had governed the country for more than 5 decades. Bonolo Mariba reports.
Duma Boko, a lawyer, exchanged his gowns for occupying the highest office in Botswana. As a human rights activist, Boko has always aspired to see a united Africa. He demonstrated this by inviting both the ANC and the EFF to the conference.
Economic freedom fighters, the African National Congress, all of them must step up in order to step back and reflect on the existential threat that faces their country and the rest of the region, and indeed the continent. And when they do, I hope they rise above and beyond some of these differences.
EFF leader Julius Malema was once declared persona non grata in Botswana after he questioned the government on its relationship with the United States, particularly on its military activities, which also led to his expulsion from the ANC. However, since then, he is free to visit Botswana, and while he didn't attend the conference, the party's deputy president, Godrich Godi, was there.
We are afraid, Comrade President. The military base of the United States in Botswana is a threat to the existence of South Africa, because the economic freedom fighters will take over that country in no time. And by that time, they will still be in the soil of Botswana, and it will take them a second to bomb the union buildings of the EFF government.
The ANC, that has a long-standing relationship with the Botswana Democratic Party, had to come to terms with the recent political change in Botswana, and now has to accommodate the BNF as its sister party. This is ANC NEC member Andile Lungisa.
We must be able to speak with one voice. We must be able to transform the institutions of international government at the international level, especially the UN. We must be able to go as south to south, the global south, as a force to transform those institutions. Those institutions, they need your leadership. That's why we're here as the ANC, to confirm that we'll work with the organization.
The ANC will be hosting a variety of liberation organizations and friends of the party on the continent this weekend for the Liberation Movement Summit in Johannesburg. The BDP and BNF are expected to attend. Bonolo Maribe, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Africa, meet Abedi.
Yeah, that's me.
Abedi is a music lover through and through.
I really love African music.
He's got a taste for all kinds of tunes and spends his days listening to Channel Africa. Guess what? He didn't know.
Okay.
Channel Africa wants to help Abedi and all music lovers everywhere to discover even more incredible music. That is why Channel Africa is calling on all African musicians to submit their music. Musicians, remember to give us all your relevant information. Make your submissions at music@channelafrica.co.za. Submissions are your chance to be heard on radio. But sadly, they do not guarantee that you will be playlisted. All submissions will be carefully reviewed to see if they meet our station's requirement. Channel Africa, the African perspective. The pulse of the continent in 60 minutes. Stay informed and inspired with Africa World Hour on Channel Africa.
All right, Rwanda is under reviewed international scrutiny as it faces its universal periodic review at the United Nations Human Rights Council. While the country has made progress in some areas, serious concerns remain, ranging from political repression and media censorship to alleged abuse in detention centers and even cross borders. Human Rights Watch has submitted a detailed report outlining these issues. We're now joined by Louis Mudge, Central African Director at Human Rights Watch, to unpack the findings and what they mean to Rwanda's human rights records. Louis, thank you so much for your time. Welcome to
Innocent, thanks for having me.
Yeah, perhaps let me begin by asking you, give us a big picture. What's the current state of human rights in Rwanda since the last UN review?
Well, yeah, these are periodic reviews, so they happen every few years, as you said. The last time Rwanda had its review was in 2021. And the UPR is unique because it's UN member states making recommendations to other UN member states. However, groups like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and the like, we do have an opportunity to submit our own submissions. And to answer your question, Rwanda in the last few years, it really has gotten back on the headlines when it comes to support to the M23 in South Africa, in Congo, which is not going to be surprising to any listeners in South Africa because, as you're well aware, South Africa had peacekeepers in Eastern Congo at this time. And so whilst that, the support that Rwanda has been given to armed militias and armed groups outside of Rwanda's borders is certainly something that we're covering in our submission. We also want to use this as an opportunity to focus internally on what's happening in Rwanda. Rwanda makes the headlines for what's happening externally in countries like the Congo. But the fact is that over the last few years, since the last time they were up before the UPR, in terms of independent media, space for opposition parties, and space for civil society members, we've seen that space continually contract, and we see a real clampdown on both freedom of expression and freedom of association in Rwanda. And so this was high time to raise attention to that, in our opinion, as well.
Louis, we keep hearing about opposition members and journalists being jailed and some, of course, harassed. We know that some of this information has to be verified, but is it still so hard to speak out in Rwanda, and why is that?
Short answer, yes, absolutely. It is. Listen, anyone who criticizes the ruling party, anyone who criticizes government policy, or anyone who criticizes or who questions the last 30 years of history and how we got to where we are, takes significant risks in Rwanda, and that's just an unequivocal fact. There are threats, intimidations, there are suspicious deaths, there are disappearances, and there's the use of prosecutions against anyone who questions the government. The fact is that this is a very, very controlled and constricted space when it comes to your ability to criticize. And unfortunately, we've seen that space continue to decrease since the last time they were up in front of the UPR.
So you were blocked from entering Rwanda earlier this year, and what can you tell us about that? How was the experience?
So that wasn't me. That was my colleague Clémentine de Montjoie. She was blocked in 2024, but I myself was blocked in 2018. So I've certainly been there, and very much unfortunately, I was not. We had one researcher kicked out back in 2011, and in 2010 we had another researcher blocked. So we've had this is nothing new for us at Human Rights Watch. When I myself was kicked out, first of all, my work visa had been withheld. So I had to relocate to Nairobi from Kigali. And then subsequently, on one of my attempts to try to enter the country, I was refused admission and I was declared persona non grata. Unfortunately, this is one of the risks that comes with working for Human Rights Watch on countries like Rwanda. I think it more points to the fact that, unlike, look, United States, where I am a native of the United States, countries like South Africa, these are governments that don't necessarily want people, looking into human rights abuses and questioning things. But when you block the ability of independent observers like Human Rights Watch to come into your country, that really sends a message. To be clear, there are only a few countries in the world that don't allow Human Rights Watch to operate, and Rwanda is one of them. The other countries include North Korea, China, Russia. I mean, this gives you an example as to how authoritarian the measures can be in Kigali.
Let me then talk about your report. One of the cases that stood out in your report is the suspicious death of journalist John Williams Ntwali. What do we know about what happened?
Look, John Williams Ntwali, he was one of the few remaining investigative journalists in the country. He was also someone that myself and our researcher who currently works on Rwanda, Ms. de Montjoie, know very well. And he had been receiving threats. He had been receiving threats for the work that he was doing. he was someone who knew very well about the risks he was taking, and he took precautions to mitigate those risks. Nonetheless, in a move that is very much not like anything he would have done. He died at very early hours in the morning in a very suspicious and dubious motorcycle crash. No one knew where actually he was going. And there are a lot of questions that we have with regards to the cause of death, not least of which is that the trial against the individual who was supposed to have been involved in the crash was held behind closed doors. This is the death of John Williams Ntwali, very much unfortunately, is just one in just a long range of mysterious deaths in Rwanda. The fact is that when you become someone who investigates, looks into what's happening, questions official narratives, you run a serious risk. We've seen this over and over and over again. These people end up committing suicide in detention. They end up dying in mysterious auto or motorcycle accidents. Or, you have the case of Patrick Karegeya in South Africa, who was killed in Pretoria, who was murdered in his own hotel room. So they're not, by any means, they're not just safe within the confines, just as in danger in the confines of Rwanda. They're very much in danger outside as well.
Well, Louis, allow me to put you on the spot, and I hope I'm going to get this out of you. There are some shocking accounts of, torture and detention. How widespread is this? And in your research, what kind of evidence have you found?
Yeah, I mean, look, in terms of your first part of your question, widespread, it's difficult to say. The fact is that the system in Rwanda is very effective, and most people don't speak up. Most people don't assert fundamental liberties of expression or association. I mean, Paul Kagame wins 99% of the vote for a variety of reasons, but one of them is that there's no meaningful opposition, and if you try to actually vote for that meaningful opposition, you run the risk of people finding out that you're voting for it, and that in of itself is inherently risky. So in terms of the widespread nature, just by mere attrition, since the ruling RPF and Kagame took over in July of 1994, Kagame officially being elected in 2002, there's just not many folks left. So, we don't want to exaggerate the sheer numbers of political opponents. There just aren't many left. With regards to the evidence, look, Human Rights Watch, we've been working in the country since 1995, even though we've had scores of researchers, sent away and kicked out. We continue to have good networks in the region across the Great Lakes, and we continue to get our work done.
Just before I let you go, as a parting shot, has anyone actually been held accountable for these abuses?
Very, very few. There are some cases in Rwanda. Look, it's not to say it's a lost cause. The judiciary, whilst it's not independent, it's highly educated. And these are very, very competent and capable people, just as competent as anyone you'd find anywhere in the world. And there have been some very isolated cases of prison officials, most recently, being held accountable for torture of other prisoners. And that's something that we at HRW have applauded and celebrated. But the fact is that those cases are very few. And that the problems with regards to impunity and human rights abuses is much deeper than what a few cases can resolve.
All right. Louis, thank you so much for making the time. And thank you so much for always making sure that human rights are upheld in the continent. Have a very good evening.
Innocent, thank you. Have a good evening to you.
All right. There you have it. Louis March, Central African Director at Human Rights Watch, to unpacking really the issues that has to do with Rwanda and human rights issues in that part of the continent. It has just gone 22 minutes after 9 o'clock Central African time. This is Channel Africa, the African perspective.
Você é fluente em português? É apaixonado por rádio e quer trabalhar na África do Sul? Você tem documentos que o qualificam para trabalhar na África do Sul? Nesse caso, podemos ter uma oportunidade para você trabalhar no Canal África. Envie seu currículo e demonstração para Canal África at newsroom@channelafrica.co.za. Lembre-se, se você não receber alguma resposta nossa em 14 dias, isso significa que você não foi selecionado. Canal África, a perspectiva africana.
The Morning Switch Weekend. with the Shy Guy.
Madzuka kwanji nonse, Zukani, the Shy Guy, a morning switch.
Have you ever listened to a song and then it gives you goosebumps? Cause it takes you way back in the 80s. My goodness. Yay. Woo. Hey, baby. You hear Yvonne Chaga Chaga there. I wanna talk to the DJ. And then the DJ goes like, hey, baby, I've got you on the other side. Huh? There were no WhatsApps then, right? There were no sliding in the TMs at the time. Oh, man.
Your weekend mornings are activated with the Shy Guy on the Morning Switch. The pulse of the continent in 60 minutes. Stay informed and inspired with Africa World Hour on Channel Africa.
All right, let's now go to Nigeria. More than 3.7 million people are facing food insecurity in Nigeria, with the crisis most severe in the country's conflict-affected northeast. Years of violence have displaced millions, disrupted farming and deepened hunger, particularly during the current lean season. Joining us now is Katachida Ngenjana, Communications Manager for the International Community of the Red Cross in Nigeria, to discuss how communities are coping and what support is being provided on the ground. Katija, thank you so much for making the time. Welcome to Channel Africa.
Thank you very much for having me, Innocent.
All right, let's then talk about this. I mean, we do know that 3.7 million people are currently food insecure in Nigeria. Can you give us a sense of how this crisis is playing out, particularly in the northern east of the country?
Absolutely. So, as you rightly indicate, years of conflict in northeast Nigeria have displaced families. It's restricted access to farmland and disrupted local food production, which poses a huge challenge for communities who live off agriculture and livestock. In addition, we're seeing climate shocks, including torrential rains and flooding, which also significantly hamper agricultural productivity. We're seeing farmers having to walk long distances in order to access fields just to be able to grow their crops, they themselves farming on empty stomachs. And the reality is that if they are unable to farm now during the rainy season, they will have little to no food come time for harvest.
You're speaking about harvest and farmers. Let's then talk about the areas like Dikwa and Gajibo. What are some of the daily struggles farmers are facing just, to access and cultivate the land? I mean, you just mentioned some of them, that the issues around walking distances, but what are some of the key challenges that they're facing, these farmers?
So access to land, number one, is limited and often restricted for safety of farmers and for communities. So many farmers have no choice but to walk long distances to reach land that they can safely farm on. Mothers like Bentu Konto, who we spoke to, have to balance farming with caring for their children, knowing that if they don't go out to farm, there may be nothing to eat. So it's imperative that farmers and communities are able to access fields safely and have enough time in the fields for planting. Farmers need sustained access to land, tools, as well as to support in order to rebuild their livelihoods.
Yeah, Katija, we do know that, the issues around malnutrition remains a growing concern, not only in Nigeria, but in the continent, some parts of the continent. What kind of support is the ICRC offering, especially for children and mothers in that part of the continent?
So if I may just start with the ICRC's Agricultural Assistance Program. This year, more than 21,000 farming households have received seeds that are tailored to local climate conditions. Also, we've provided seed planting tools which help to reduce the labor burdens that are often placed on farmers, as well as to improve efficiency so that farmers are spending less time in the fields. This support also includes both field crops and vegetables, including rice, maize, tomato, and which contributes to greater dietary diversity, but also nutritional value. Farmers are also trained in sustainable farming practices, not only to build their own capacity, but also to support continuity beyond the ICRC's intervention. Now, coming to malnutrition, because food insecurity contributes and fuels to malnutrition, especially with children rather under the age of 5, as well as pregnant or breastfeeding women, the ICRC also supports health centers that are called malnutrition stabilization centers, which help to detect and to treat cases of malnutrition. We also provide community training at community level in order to ensure that we're able to prevent malnutrition altogether.
But I'm keen to know, what are some of the hurdles that you're facing in making sure that you support these farmers and communities to sustain themselves? Are you seeing the government coming to the party to really join hands with you and make sure that this becomes a success?
So it is imperative that we work together with authorities in order to access communities safely and implement some of these projects that the ICRC has. All of these interventions are part of the ICRC's approach towards sustainable humanitarian impact. So these seeds, planting tools are not just meant to last this rainy season or this harvest season, but really as a sustainable approach for communities to be able to fend for themselves and to grant them their independence and restore their dignity.
Yeah. So beyond the short-term relief, what steps is the ICRC taking to promote long-term food security and resilience?
Absolutely. So for communities that rely on agriculture, it's imperative that farmers and communities are able to access these fields safely and have enough time in the fields for planting. So for the ICRC, we will continue to support farming communities and farming households in terms of receiving these seeds that are specifically tailored to the local communities, as well as planting tools to help them spend less time in the fields, which is what they're currently doing.
All right. Finally, before I let you go, what is your message to the broader public and stakeholders as the crisis deepens?
So it is absolutely imperative that farmers and communities are able to access fields safely and have enough time in the fields for planting. Farmers need sustainable and sustained access to safe land, to safe tools, and to support in order to rebuild their livelihoods.
All right. Khatija, thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you very much, Innocent.
There you have it. Khatija Nganjana, Communications Manager for the International Community of the Red Cross in Nigeria, discussing the issues around malnutrition in that area and also the issues of, food scarcity. That conversation brings us to exactly 21:31 Central African Time.
Você é fluente em português? É apaixonado por rádio e quer trabalhar na África do Sul? Você tem documentos que o qualificam para trabalhar na África do Sul? Nesse caso, podemos ter uma oportunidade para você trabalhar no Canal África. Envie seu currículo e demonstração para Canal África at newsroom@channelafrica.co.za. Lembre-se, se você não receber alguma resposta nossa em 14 dias, isso significa que você não foi selecionado. Canal África, a perspectiva africana.
Africa, meet Abedi.
Yeah, that's me.
Abedi is a music lover through and through.
I really love African music.
He's got a taste for all kinds of tunes and spends his days listening to Channel Africa. Guess what? He didn't know.
Okay.
Channel Africa wants to help Abedi and all music lovers everywhere to discover even more incredible music. That is why Channel Africa is calling on all African musicians to submit their music. Musicians, remember to give us all your relevant information. Make your submissions at music@channelafrica.co.za. Submissions are your chance to be heard on radio. But sadly, they do not guarantee that you'll be playlisted. All submissions will be carefully reviewed to see if they meet our station's requirement. Channel Africa, the African perspective. The pulse of the continent in 60 minutes. Stay informed and inspired with Africa World Hour on Channel Africa.
All right. Now, South Africa is heading towards a day of reckoning, at least according to Max Nezelish, a senior analyst at the Center on economic and financial power and a former advisor at the U.S. Treasury Office of Foreign Assets Control. In a recent column for the Wall Street Journal, Maislish warned that global markets are dangerously underestimating South Africa's growing sanctions and compliance risks. Now, especially, of course, looking at the issues that are currently happening in the country. Max joins us now on the line. Max, thank you so much for making the time.
Thanks for having me.
All right, Max, you recently wrote that a day of reckoning is coming for South Africa. Can you briefly summarize what led to your this conclusion?
Yeah, of course. As part of my work here at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and our Center on Economic and Financial Power, I'm looking at threats to U.S. interests and allied interests. And over the last several months, for about a year now, we've been looking at South Africa as a jurisdiction of increased risk from a sanctions perspective and compliance. And what we see is that since the beginning of the Trump presidency, more aggressive actions have been taken by the United States against South Africa. And in part, that's because of choices taken by South Africa, and in particular by leaders of the ANC that are more malign in nature and bringing South Africa more in partnership with certain adversaries of the United States, such as China, Russia, Iran, and Iran's proxies.
Yeah. You also say that the Wall Street is mispricing South Africa's risks. What exactly is being overlooked by markets and financial institutions, in your view?
So normally what we would want to see is when governments are growing closer to adversaries of the West, that the markets are going to react more negatively to that. And that's separate from the fact that there's been all of these aggressive actions taken from the Trump administration. So it's worrying in my eye that markets aren't necessarily reacting in as strong of a way as you might suspect. And perhaps that's because the risk isn't being seen for what it actually is. And so as I lay out in the piece, which I recommend your listeners go check out, the Wall Street Journal, what we see is that over the last several months, actions have been taken by the Trump administration to increasingly isolate South Africa in a way that demonstrates South Africa is taking on more of a pariah-like status in Washington. And so that begins from February, when President Trump issued a sweeping executive order that suspended financial assistance towards South Africa. It then expelled the country's ambassador in March. There were recent reports that the special envoy who had been sent over to the United States was actually denied a visa. And then there's a signal that the administration may actually oppose the AGOA trade program, which has key benefits to certain sectors of the South African economy. So when you take all that together, you would expect to see more price risk. Or an understanding that there is greater risk in South Africa, and potentially people will open up to that reality.
Yeah, I'm glad that you're talking about the issues that has to do with politics and the geopolitical angle. I mean, South Africa's ambassador, expelled in America. How has South Africa's alignment with China, Russia, and Iran heightened its exposure to U.S. sanctions and financial isolation? And I'm asking because there's a general narrative out there that people suggest that because South Africa is a junior partner in the BRICS bloc, so it finds itself vulnerable to those attacks by the United States. How has this been a challenge for South Africa, this alignment?
Well, it seems to me that South Africa, and particularly driven by some interests within the ANC, are driving the country closer towards those countries, and as a matter of choice, and not necessarily out of necessity. I think that the reality is that South Africa can and should be a great partner to the United States, like the United States should be a great partner to South Africa. But the reality is that because of these growing alignments, in fact, South Africa moving away from its stated non-alignment posture and more into supporting China, Russia, Iran, and its proxies, this has invited attention in a negative way. And so what we saw from the February executive order, not only did President Trump have concerns about some of the land reform issues and expropriation laws in South Africa, but also in the executive order, they highlight how South Africa is taking meaningful steps to reinvigorate its relationship with Iran along civil, commercial, nuclear cooperation. So that's a big deal for it to be called out like that in an executive order. The administration also noted other foreign policy entanglements between South Africa and other adversaries of the United States. And this has drawn attention from members of Congress, including key members of Congress who sit on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And in fact, your viewers, or your listeners might be interested in knowing that tomorrow the House Foreign Affairs Committee will be reviewing a piece of legislation referred to as the U.S.-South Africa Bilateral Relations Review Act. And in that bill, it calls for against the ANC and other government who are more malign in their foreign policy towards the United States.
Yeah. So we do know that South Africa is chairing the G20 presidency, and we've seen America increasingly skipping the G20 meetings. I mean, we just concluded the finance track in Sherpa Finance track in Durban. But in your view, what signal did U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent skipping the G20 meetings? The Cape Town one, the Durban one. What does this send to the financial markets and investors? How is this putting South Africa? Is it a turning point? How is it sitting with South Africa in your view?
So in my assessment, what all these actions taken together suggest is that Washington is attempting to isolate Pretoria. And there's still time for action to be taken, positive action to be taken by the South Africans, and moving away from these more malign foreign policy stances that have been taken in relation to China, Russia, Iran, and Iran's proxies. But the reality is...
Sort of to cut in, where do you think South Africa, how do you think South Africa should go about it? Because these are, they say that it's because they are a multilateral country, they can be friends with the BRICS bloc and friends with America at the same time. And how do you think South Africa can go about just abandoning the BRICS bloc and other friends and focusing on America alone?
Yeah. And so it's a good question, and there's a lot of ways in which countries can engage in trade and normal diplomatic relations with other countries, even countries that the United States doesn't have the best relationship with. But actions do have consequences, and when a country like South Africa willfully participates in military exercises with China or Russia, or has great investment in Iran's telecommunications sector through MTN Irancell, these are real concrete actions that a government is taking to support. And it would be through those types of actions that the U.S. is looking at South Africa and saying, okay, well, they're pushing away from the United States. So disassociating the South African government from that type of support would be a meaningful step in the right direction.
Yeah. And also there's been controversy around the appointment of Tsepiso Maketwetla as special envoy to the U.S. How has that, situation impacted the U.S.-South Africa diplomatic relations in practice? And I'm asking because we know that he's chairing, he's part of the MTN, and MTN was doing things with Iraq. So how has that put South Africa and America's in terms of diplomatic relations?
I think that the view in Washington for quite some time since the special envoy was announced as the representative coming over to represent the presidency was that he was the wrong man for the job. And after the expulsion of South Africa's ambassador, Ibrahim Rasool, there was hope in Washington that South Africa would send someone who was focused more on addressing key concerns related to trade and talking in a meaningful way. But it's notable that given the fact that the president's February executive order talked about South Africa reinvigorating its relationship with Iran to include commercial and nuclear relations, the individual sent over is one of the key key representatives of South Africa to a major venture in Iran. So I don't know if this is the government, not reading the signals right, or just getting it entirely wrong altogether. So it's really unclear. But the view from Washington is that he was the wrong man for this job, and I think that the fact that it demonstrates that.
Yeah, but the presidency tells us that he was at the center of preparing the meeting between him and Ramaphosa. But you also warn about possible sanctions on South Africa's banks and state-owned entities. What kind of triggers could bring, that about, in terms of the challenges that we're facing already?
Yeah, so as I put out in the piece, there's growing interest in Congress to sanction individual members of parliament or ANC officials that are responsible for some acts of corruption, human rights abuses, all things that I think a lot of South Africans would actually welcome to the extent that it relates to corruption in the country. But beyond that, there's significant sanctions exposure to the firms that are actually facilitating dealings between entities in South Africa and entities in, say, Russia and Iran, where there's exposure to Russia's financial services sector, to certain nefarious cryptocurrency exchanges, to the extent that there's investment in minerals and mining sectors. We saw that come out from the recent trade delegation that went to Russia. The top line news item was we want to double or triple trade in certain strategic sectors, including energy and financial services and mining. And these are all the specific areas of the Russian economy that are heavily under U.S. sanctions and clearly invite sanctions for South African firms that are going to do that investment.
Max, you've said that the ANC is drifting towards authoritarian regimes, and this could expose the entire financial system. What are the reputational and financial consequences if this path continues? And one can say, hang on, that's not true because the ANC is in the government of national unity. Things starting to, the leaders are being called to account. Wouldn't you agree that perhaps the GNU brought a bit of light? And why do you suggest that the ANC is drifting towards that kind of regime?
My job is to be an analyst, and this is the path that I see unfolding before us, and it's been years in the making. But all of this is happening in plain sight, and frankly, what worries me is the extent to which there's activity that may be more nefarious that is happening under the radar. And there were concerns about the extent to which South Africa might be enabling shipment of weapons to Russia. That's very worrisome. And with respect to reputational risk, there's major financial institutions that are operating in South Africa, and this is a little bit in the weeds for your listeners, right? But the nature of how money moves across the world is that banks in South Africa have exposure through what are called correspondent accounts with firms in the United States, and that's how they can move dollars. And so when firms in the United States might begin to think that there's a greater risk profile in South Africa as it relates to adversaries of the West, they might selectively choose to not do as much business. And what could be even more significant is if U.S. sanctions prevent them from doing that in the first place.
Yeah. Finally, Max, what corrective steps, if any, can South African government take now to avoid isolation or further penalties?
So signal, and this doesn't eliminate all of these other risks as they relate to China, Russia, and Iran, but a major signal I think that this administration in the United States and members of Congress would see as a step in the right direction would be the government changing its posture towards Israel and the lawfare against Israel. But that, like I said, that doesn't discount these other threats, right? And so the extent to which there's a memorandum of understanding between South Africa and Russia or South Africa and China on areas of technological cooperation, of military cooperation. I mean, these are really things that the South African government needs to assess whether it's in the interest of South Africa to do and the nature of the consequence that they're inviting. So moving away from those types of actions and demonstrating to the United States that, in fact, South Africa wants to be a good and valuable partner to the United States and it's willing to take the actions in that direction, that would be what's most meaningful.
Yeah. 1st of August, tariffs are kicking in. Do you think there's still time to restore trust? Is there still hope to change things around?
You know, I wouldn't bet one way or another as to whether the tariffs will go into effect. I mean, what we've seen is that there have been delays, and so I really can't say one way or another. But I will say that meaningful action can lead to meaningful responses, and if the government wants to take a change of course and demonstrate in a really credible and meaningful way, I think the administration would be entirely open to that. Because, like I said at the top, the view in Washington is that South Africa can and should be a valuable partner and ally to the United States, but it's going to be up to the South African government to see if that happens.
All right. Max, thank you so much for making the time and sharing your insights.
Of course, thank you.
There you have it. That was Max Maislish, senior researcher, analyst at the Center on Economic and Financial Power, sharing insights on South Africa's rising geopolitical and compliance risks, and what are some of the things that we can expect ahead. That conversation brings us to exactly 21:48 Central African time.
Mornings made better with Peter and Asanda on Rise and Shine, weekdays 6 till 9.
In recent weeks, East Africa has seen a disturbing rise in human rights violations. In Kenya, digital activist Rose Njeri was arrested under the Computer Misuse and Cybercrimes Act after creating a tool for citizens to oppose the Finance Bill 2025. Meanwhile, in Tanzania, Kenyan activist Boniface Mwangi and Ugandan lawyer Agatha Atuhaire reported being detained, tortured, and sexually assaulted by security officers.
East Africa needs a reset. We need to get back East Africa to where the founding fathers are. When President Nyerere and his colleagues, Jomo Kenyatta and the Ugandan counterparts fought for independence. They fought for independence to get Africans out of poverty, to get Africans out of slavery. The leaders who took up power have since gotten into regression.
Neto Agostino, co-leader of the United Green Movement Party.
Mornings made better with Peter and Asanda on Rise and Shine.
Parlez-vous couramment le français? Êtes-vous passionné par la radio? Et êtes-vous qualifié pour travailler en Afrique du Sud? Envoyez-nous votre CV et votre 3 minutes démo en MP3 à @channelafrica.co.za pour avoir une chance de rejoindre la famille Channel Africa. Si vous n'avez pas de réponse après 14 jours, cela signifie que vous n'avez pas été retenu. Channel Africa, la perspective africaine.
Africa World Hour. Unpacking global headlines from an African perspective.
SABC Sports brings you Chasing the Sun, a powerful 5-part documentary series about the Springboks, telling the renouncing tale of their path to redemption and ultimate World Cup glory in 2019. Starting 13 July at 7:30 p.m. on SABC2. Tune in every Sunday for the heights, the heartache, and the heroic that made rugby history, streaming each chapter on SABC Plus anytime, anyway. No subscription needed. Don't miss it. Chasing the Sun this Sunday at 7:30 p.m. on SABC2. Be there when history shines.
The pulse of the continent in 60 minutes. Stay informed and inspired with Africa World Hour on Channel Africa.
All right, on to this now. 50 years after one of Uganda's most infamous leader, Idi Amin, declared himself the liberator of an oppressed majority, his legacy and rhetoric still resonate today. Amin's violent and unpredictable regime left a deep mark on Uganda and beyond. But he also mastered the art of political myth, convincing many that his rule was a fight against colonialism and injustice. Joining us now is Derek R. Peterson, Ali Mazuri, a professor of history and African studies at the University of Michigan, who recently wrote an insightful article exploring how Amin's claim to liberation was a powerful yet deceptive political tool, one that offers important lesson for understanding today's populist leaders around the world. Professor Peterson, thank you so much for making the time. Welcome to Channel Africa.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah. What got you interested in Idi Amin again, especially after all these years? Why does his history still matter today?
Well, it happens. I've just written a book published a couple of weeks ago called A Popular History of Idi Amin's Uganda. That's full-length popular history work that tries to explain why Ugandans found Idi Amin so attractive as a leader. He's often remembered today as a tyrant, as a bloody buffoon who murdered hundreds of thousands of people. And I don't really disbelieve those claims about his ferocity or his bloodiness. But the point that the book tries to make is that for a lot of good reasons, Ugandans in the 1970s found reasons to support Idi Amin's government, even though they knew and were terrified at its violence. They also found reasons to invest themselves in it, to support it, to enthusiastically try to propound the promises that Idi Amin offered. He was an effective creator of a myth that held out, as I argue in the essay that you just described, a myth that held that his violent government was engaged in liberating Africa, and that was the story that was at the foundation of his regime, really.
Yeah. You and I know, Prof, that he's known for painting himself. He was known for painting himself as a kind of a liberator. But how did he manage to convince people of that, even when his actions were so brutal?
Well, among other things, he was engaged with South African liberation. He hosted, over the course of some years, a number of delegations from the Pan-Africanist Congress, the PAC, whose leader was Potlako Lebalo in those years. Lebalo came to Kampala on a number of occasions, along with several hundred PAC fighters, to receive military training from Ugandan soldiers, regular Ugandan army men, that is. It's not entirely clear to me what they actually learned, neither is it clear to me that their training was of any military value. But for Amin, the opportunity to host Pan-African Congress rebels, guerrillas as they were, was an opportunity to demonstrate his commitment to Southern Africa's liberation from white-dominated regimes. It was through these kind of theatrical performances, hosting Abo Muzarewa, hosting Potlako Lebalo, claiming to be engaged in the war of liberating African Americans, the struggle for civil rights. All these were for Amin theatrical opportunities that convinced many people that Uganda was in fact engaged in a continental struggle for Black liberation. Yeah.
And Prof, from your research, I'm keen to know what was the real impact of those policies on everyday people in Uganda?
Ugandans took the promises of the 1970s seriously. And in some regards, they were widely popular and even successful. So in 1972, Amin famously expelled Uganda's Asian minority, throwing about 50,000 people out of the country on 3 months' notice. This was a hugely inhumane thing, greatly, reviled in the press in the global north, and for good reason. For Ugandan Asians, the expulsion was a disaster. But for Black Ugandans, it was an opportunity both to enrich themselves, but also to participate, as many thought, in the effort to claim Uganda's economy from an immigrant minority that had stolen Uganda's wealth for their own advantage. That idea that Asians had interposed themselves in Uganda's economy to their own enrichment and at the expense of Black Ugandans was at the foundation of this kind of populist resentment that Amin managed to tap into in the 1970s as a means of authenticating his own government. His campaign against the Asians Their expulsion was the foundation of his claim that his government was lifting up Black Ugandans and Black people more generally and liberating them from outsiders' control.
Yeah, Prof, just before I let you go, it seems to me that Idi Amin had a way of capturing people. And it's interesting that some African-American leaders actually supported him back then. What do you think drew them to his vision?
So in the mid-70s, a whole number of Black Americans came to Uganda, like the PAC leaders did at the same time, because they saw him as a champion of Black liberation. Black Americans in those years were trying to figure out how to build an economy that worked for Black Americans. And for a time, they regarded, that is particularly the Congress of Racial Equality, led by a man named Roy Innis. Roy Innis and others, Stokely Carmichael, came to Uganda in those years because they saw Amin and his effort to build a Black-run economy as exemplary for Black Americans too. So, here's an instance where Uganda's history offered a source of inspiration to Black Americans, and for a time, a kind of orientation for liberation struggles around the world, really.
Prof. Derek, thank you so much for making the time, and it's always awesome to listen to your views. Have a good evening.
Thank you very much, Innocent.
All right, there you have it. That Professor Derek R. Peterson, from a professor of history and African studies at the University of Michigan, talking to us there about the legacy of Idi Amin that has really shaped a lot of controversies. But up next is the Hardline. My colleague just walked in. Colleague, a very good evening to you. What can we expect on the Hardline this evening?
Hi, Innocent. So today is World Brain Day. Now, Rise and Shine with Peter Ndoro and Asanda Bet. I've covered it. On the Move, I've also spoken about the realities of World Brain Day. We want to look at the brain from the aspect of your brain being an enemy or a friend, So friend or foe, or is it frenemy is the question. I mean, it is suggested that over 90% of your lived experience is a suggestion from your brain's view.
So are you saying we're still learning about this?
Absolutely. I mean, if we're only now, somewhat 10 years ago, saying that the gut is the second brain, some are arguing it's the first brain. We truly are in discovery when it comes to the brain. And so we're going to be talking about the brain. Of course, we give you a roundup on what comes up, or rather what comes up on the show, but also some of the highlights of the conversations that were had on Channel Africa, all the way from Rise and Shine through to your very last conversation, which sounded very interesting there.
Thank you so much. I'm going to listen because I want to know, why does the brain gets it wrong sometimes, learn, and then and the nerves also. I know that it's got many neurons there, but it would be nice to hear the conversation. I wish you a beautiful show, colleague.
Thank you.
All right, that's my lot on Africa World Hour. It's exactly 2200 Central African time. From myself, Innocent Semosa, and the team behind the scenes, it's goodbye and God bless.
Hotlines bring you fresh perspectives about love,